When my parents died, I thought the inheritance would be fair, but Thomas inherited the $500,000 Albuquerque property, while I ended up with an abandoned house near the Pueblo reservation. 3 days later, my wife Rebecca left me, saying she wouldn't stay with a loser. What she didn't know was that the house held secrets, family betrayal, and a cultural inheritance that would change everything. My name is Andrew Miller. I'm 42 years old, a licensed architect living in Santa Fe, New Mexico. For 2 decades, I built a solid career designing adobe homes and restoring historic buildings across the region. My life followed a predictable rhythm: mornings in the office, afternoons on site, and dinners at home with my wife Rebecca. It was a routine that worked perfectly. At least, that's what I believed at the time. Rebecca worked as a luxury real estate agent and knew the value of every Santa Fe property better than any appraiser. Our 15-year marriage was based on mutual respect and shared goals, building a comfortable and stable life. She admired my restoration work and always praised my dedication to architectural details. We had a pleasant social calendar, attending dinners with other couples and cultural events around town. Family was always a calm topic in our conversations. Rebecca came from a successful business family in Albuquerque, while I grew up hearing interesting stories about my paternal grandparents who lived in the rural areas of New Mexico. My parents, before passing away, always showed pride in my work as an architect. They enjoyed visiting my restoration sites and asking technical questions about colonial construction techniques. My older brother, Thomas, had built a real estate empire in Albuquerque and maintained a cordial relationship with me. During the family gatherings we had before our parents died, he would share stories about his commercial projects, while I talked about the colonial churches and historic houses I was restoring. Rebecca took an active part in both conversations, showing genuine interest in both brothers' work. It was a harmonious and respectful family dynamic. Restoration projects gave me deep satisfaction, especially when I preserved unique architectural elements from the Spanish colonial period. Every old wooden beam, every original adobe wall, every decorative detail had a story to tell. Rebecca often accompanied me to the sites on weekends, taking progress photos and suggesting small landscaping tweaks. She understood my passion for historical preservation and supported me fully. Our social life revolved around Santa Fe's architectural and real estate community. We attended events hosted by the Architects Association, local art exhibitions, and charity galas for historical preservation. Rebecca was especially skilled at networking, introducing me to potential clients and maintaining strong professional relationships. She had a natural talent for connecting people and business opportunities. It was a partnership that worked both personally and professionally. Weekends were our time to rest and explore New Mexico's rich cultural heritage. We visited museums, native art galleries, and archaeological sites in the region. Rebecca showed genuine curiosity about local history, asking insightful questions about indigenous construction techniques. These excursions strengthened our connection and inspired me in my restoration work. It was a full and meaningful life. In the years before our parents died, they had mentioned properties that once belonged to our grandparents. My father sounded nostalgic when he described the house where he grew up, located in a rural area outside Santa Fe. Rebecca showed polite interest during these conversations, asking about the historic and architectural value of the old properties. They were pleasant talks that connected us to our family roots with no tension or concern apparent. The reading of the will took place on a cold March morning at the family lawyer's office in downtown Santa Fe. I expected an equitable split between Thomas and me, something that reflected the equal love our parents had always shown both their sons. Rebecca squeezed my hand as the lawyer opened the official documents, and I felt her anticipation through the tightness of her grip. The office smelled of old leather and strong coffee, creating a solemn atmosphere fitting for the moment. Thomas was to inherit the main family property in Albuquerque, a modern 2-story home valued at over $500,000, plus the commercial office our parents owned downtown. I listened carefully, mentally calculating the remaining assets still to be divided. The lawyer continued listing investments, bank accounts, and other assets accompanying the inheritance. Rebecca's grip tightened when she heard the figures, and I took that as emotional support. Then came my portion. An abandoned house on land near the Pueblo reservation, about an hour from Santa Fe. The lawyer described the property as in a state of significant disrepair and noted it hadn't been inhabited for over 20 years. The contrast was glaring. As Thomas received a modern, profitable property, I got something that felt more like a burden than a gift. I felt a strange knot in my stomach, like something fundamental had changed in my family forever. Rebecca released my hand abruptly as the reading concluded. During the drive home, she remained silent, answering my attempts at conversation with monosyllables or nods. Once home, she went straight to the office and started making calls, speaking quietly about reassessing investments and shifting strategy. When I tried to bring up the inheritance, she held up her hand, asking for silence as if I were an unwelcome interruption. Our first real argument happened at dinner, when Rebecca finally broke her silence. She put down her fork more forcefully than necessary and looked me directly in the eyes, for the first time since that morning. "Andrew, do you realize what happened today?" she asked in a tone I had never heard before. Cold, calculating, almost professional. She began outlining how our parents had shown a lack of respect for me, making it clear that Thomas was their favorite child. She suggested I should challenge the will, insisting something was wrong with it. She had already researched inheritance attorneys and had a list of legal arguments ready. "This is a clear betrayal," she said, her voice gaining strength. "You've worked your whole life as an architect, always respected your parents, and you get an abandoned house as a reward?" Her words sounded rehearsed, as if she had planned this conversation for a long time. When I mentioned wanting to visit the property before taking any legal action, Rebecca looked at me as if I'd lost my mind. She accused me of wasting time, that the house was clearly in ruins and our energy should go toward pursuing justice in court. "You're being naive, Andrew," she said, standing up from the table. "While you're sentimental about some abandoned house, Thomas is celebrating having pulled one over on us." The coldness in her voice was something completely new to me. That night, Rebecca announced she would be staying at her sister's for a few days, to give me time to think clearly about the situation. She packed methodically, as if she'd planned this departure for weeks, taking more clothes than necessary for a short stay. Before leaving, she paused at the door and said, "When you decide to fight for what's yours, call me. Until then, I need space to process how our life has changed." The door closed with a definitive click, leaving me alone with the weight of an inheritance that seemed to have destroyed more than it built. In the 3 days following Rebecca's departure, I stayed alone in our house in Santa Fe, trying to process everything that had happened. The silence was deafening, but also strangely liberating in a way I couldn't fully explain. I spent hours walking through the rooms, observing the architectural details I had restored over the years. Every wooden beam, every carefully selected tile now seemed to tell a different story. Not of a shared home, but of a man who created beautiful things, even while his own life was falling apart. On Thursday morning, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to visit the property I had inherited. Rebecca had made it clear she thought it was a waste of time, but something inside me insisted I needed to see it with my own eyes. As an architect, I understood that every building has a story to tell, and maybe that abandoned house held secrets that weren't visible in legal documents. My family might have turned their backs on me, but I wasn't going to abandon my inheritance without understanding what it truly represented. The drive to the property took exactly an hour and 15 minutes, winding along rural roads I'd never traveled before. As I got closer to the land near the Pueblo reservation, I felt a strange connection to the region, as if something in my DNA recognized the place. The house appeared on the horizon like a mirage, a 2-story adobe structure that, despite obvious neglect, retained an impressive architectural dignity. The exterior walls were cracked and faded, but the core structure was solid, with design elements clearly influenced by traditional Pueblo architecture. I parked the truck and slowly walked around the property, mentally noting what would be needed for a full restoration. The windows were broken, the roof needed serious repairs, and the vegetation had overgrown around the foundation. But there was something else, a sense that this house had been loved by someone, cared for with respect and attention to detail. When I finally opened the front door with the key the lawyer had given me, I felt like I was stepping into a personal museum of my own family's history. The interior of the house completely surprised me. Despite 20 years of abandonment, the furniture was covered with white sheets as if someone had carefully prepared the house for a temporary absence. I pulled back some of the sheets and discovered solid wood furniture, handcrafted pieces that looked like they had been made specifically for the space. There were photographs on the walls, faces I didn't recognize but with familiar features that made me pause and look closer. One photo in particular caught my attention, an older man in traditional clothing standing beside a Native American woman. As I explored the rooms, I began to realize this wasn't just a house. It was a repository of cultural legacy that someone had carefully preserved. There were Native American artifacts on shelves, books on Pueblo history and traditions, and even traditional crafting tools. In the master bedroom, I found an old desk with locked drawers, and my architect's curiosity kicked in. If my parents had left me this property, they must have expected me to discover its secrets. By late afternoon, I finally managed to open the first drawer. Inside were documents carefully organized in folders, some dating back decades. There were birth certificates, marriage records, and correspondence that mentioned names I'd never heard in our family. One letter in particular, handwritten on yellowed paper, began with, "To my grandson Andrew, when you're ready to understand who we really are." My hand trembled slightly as I held the paper. My grandfather had written a letter specifically to me, decades before I was even born. As the sun began to set, I sat on the bedroom floor surrounded by documents, photographs, and objects telling a completely different story. Not one of betrayal or injustice, but of preservation, of someone who had dedicated their life to keeping a cultural connection alive. My grandfather hadn't just left me a house. He had left me a responsibility, a legacy that went far beyond anything Thomas or Rebecca could put a dollar value on. Driving back to Santa Fe that night, I knew my life had changed forever, and that true justice would not come from courts or lawyers. I returned to the property the following Saturday, this time equipped with tools and plenty of time for a proper investigation. My grandfather's letter had mentioned important documents hidden in a secure place, and I was determined to find them. I spent the morning methodically exploring every room, tapping on walls for hidden compartments, examining the floor for loose boards. As an architect, I knew old houses often included secret spaces built during their original construction. It was in the basement that I finally found what I was looking for, a stone wall with newer mortar than the rest of the structure. After 2 hours of careful work, I removed a few stones and uncovered a sealed niche containing a rusty metal box. Inside were documents that completely transformed my understanding of our family and the inheritance I'd received. There were birth certificates revealing that my great-grandfather was half Pueblo and had married a local tribe woman. Most importantly, there were property documents proving our family had been the official guardians of sacred Pueblo artifacts for over a century. This house was not just a residence, it was a federally protected cultural repository of immeasurable historical value. The documents revealed a betrayal far beyond the unequal inheritance. Thomas had known the true value of the property for years and had deliberately manipulated our parents so I would inherit the worthless house, while he took the liquid assets. I found correspondence between Thomas and a private collector of native art, discussing the sale of the artifacts for millions of dollars. My brother wasn't just excluding me from the inheritance, he was planning to profit from illegally selling our cultural legacy, violating federal cultural preservation laws. A separate folder contained photographs and detailed inventories of every artifact in the house, all cataloged and authenticated by specialists over the decades. There were 800-year-old Pueblo ceramics, traditional turquoise jewelry, and manuscripts written in the native language documenting ceremonies and traditions lost in other communities. The cultural value was priceless, yet financial appraisals totaled over $5 million. My grandfather had dedicated his life to preserving these treasures, and Thomas was willing to destroy that legacy for personal gain. The most shocking discovery was a letter dated only 2 years ago, written by Thomas himself to an inheritance lawyer. In it, he outlined a plan to challenge our parents' mental competence should the inheritance not be divided according to his wishes. He'd even consulted doctors about legally questioning elderly people's mental state. This betrayal was not only against me, it was against our own parents, people who had trusted both their sons to honor the family legacy. Thomas was prepared to ruin our parents' reputations in order to gain access to the artifacts. Sitting on the basement floor, surrounded by documents proving decades of malicious planning, I felt a mix of anger and resolve like I had never known before. This was no longer about unequal inheritance or marital issues. It was about justice for an entire culture that had entrusted our family to safeguard its history. Thomas wasn't just stealing from me. He was stealing from future generations of Native Americans who deserved the right to know and honor their ancestral traditions. The responsibility on my shoulders was far greater than I'd ever imagined. I photographed every document, letter, and inventory, creating a complete digital archive of evidence. As an architect, I understood the importance of proper documentation, and I knew I'd need irrefutable proof for what I was planning next. I contacted a lawyer specializing in indigenous rights and cultural heritage, explained the situation, and sent copies of the most important documents. He confirmed that Thomas was planning to commit multiple federal crimes, including trafficking protected cultural artifacts and fraud against historic preservation. Justice wouldn't just come through family courts, it would come through the federal legal system. When I left the property that afternoon, I was no longer the same man who'd arrived that morning. My personal pain had transformed into a much larger mission, protecting a cultural legacy that far surpassed any monetary value Thomas or Rebecca could understand. My grandfather had chosen me for this responsibility for a reason, and I would not let him down. Thomas had gravely underestimated who he was dealing with, and he would soon discover that his betrayal had awakened a force he could never control. The real battle had only just begun, and this time, I had every weapon I needed to win. The following Monday, I put my plan into action with the precision of an architect executing a complex project. I contacted the FBI through the cultural heritage attorney, submitting all the evidence I had gathered about the federal crimes Thomas was planning. At the same time, I reached out to the Pueblo Tribal Council, explained the situation, and offered full cooperation to protect the sacred artifacts. The response was immediate and coordinated. Within hours, I had a team of federal specialists and tribal representatives working with me. Thomas was served a federal subpoena Tuesday morning, while sitting in his Albuquerque office, finalizing what he believed was the deal of a lifetime. The private collector he had been negotiating with was also subpoenaed, and we learned he was already under investigation for trafficking in cultural heritage. The operation spanned 3 states, uncovering not only the illegal sale of artifacts, but a broader network of crimes against indigenous heritage. Thomas had unknowingly gotten involved with professional criminals, and his greed had placed him at the center of a federal investigation. Thomas's betrayal ran even deeper than I'd imagined. During the investigation, we discovered he had forged our parents' signatures on documents transferring legal custody of the artifacts to himself. He had bribed a clerk to register those falsified documents, creating a chain of crimes that included forgery, bribery, and conspiracy. The FBI found emails on his computer outlining the entire scheme, including plans to remove the artifacts from the property, before I discovered their true value. Rebecca showed up at my door Wednesday night, after news of Thomas's arrest began to spread. She tried to act like nothing had happened, claiming she had always felt something was off about my brother. When she suggested we could start over now that justice had been served, I simply said, "Rebecca, you chose your side when you walked out. That choice was final." She left my house that night and never tried to contact me again. The legal process was just beginning, but the amount of evidence we had already compiled was overwhelming. Thomas was arrested and awaited trial, while the FBI continued its investigation to dismantle the broader criminal network. I knew the true battle for justice was still ahead, but I felt I had taken the first decisive step. The inheritance I received was not just physical property, it was a commitment to cultural preservation. The Pueblo Tribal Council stood firmly behind me, recognizing the importance of preserving our cultural legacy. They were involved in early negotiations to ensure the artifacts would be protected and that the property would be maintained as a sacred space. Working with them gave me a profound sense of purpose, and reinforced the respect my grandfather had always shown for this mission. It was the beginning of a partnership that would honor ancestral traditions. As I oversaw the first steps of the legal process and the protection of the artifacts, I felt a mix of determination and responsibility. Every document, every artifact carried a story that needed to be preserved for future generations. Personal revenge wasn't part of my plan. My fight was for true justice, for the preservation of a cultural legacy that transcends any material value. Thomas had completely underestimated the strength of what he was up against. I knew the road ahead would be long and challenging, but I was ready to face it. The battle was just beginning, and I was committed to honoring the legacy my grandfather had entrusted to me. The months ahead would bring legal hurdles, external pressures, and tough decisions. But one thing was certain. Our family had protected these treasures for generations, and I would not be the one to let them be lost. True justice was finally within reach. Thomas's trial took place 6 months later, and the sentence was harsher than I expected. 8 years in federal prison, seizure of all assets involved in the criminal scheme, and fines totaling over $2 million. The judge made it clear that crimes against cultural heritage are crimes against all humanity, and that Thomas's betrayal was not just against our family, but against generations of Native Americans. When I left the courthouse that day, I felt that justice had finally been served. Rebecca attempted to contact me a week after the sentence, sending a handwritten letter apologizing and asking for a second chance. She claimed she had been influenced by Thomas, and now understood the true value of the cultural inheritance I was protecting. I read the letter once, and then threw it away without responding. Some bridges once burned cannot be rebuilt, and I had learned that true trust isn't conditional or opportunistic. Thomas also tried to write to me from prison, a pathetic letter full of apologies, claiming he never intended to hurt the family. He said he had been consumed by greed and now understood his wrongdoing. The letter ended with a plea for me to visit him so we could talk as brothers about the future. I ripped it up without finishing. Some betrayals are irreversible, and once trust is broken this way, it can never be restored. Santa Fe's community had mixed reactions. Some fellow architects congratulated me for having the courage to expose federal crimes, while others quietly said I had destroyed my own family out of pride. Their comments no longer affected me. I'd learned that doing the right thing isn't always popular, but it's always necessary. The validation I sought wasn't in social approval, but in the certainty that I was honoring a legacy far greater than my own existence. The cultural center began to take physical shape, even as the legal processes wrapped up. With support from the Pueblo Tribal Council and historical preservation organizations, we secured funding for a full restoration that honored both the original architecture and sacred traditions. Every restored beam, every rebuilt wall carried the weight of the responsibility my grandfather entrusted to me. It was work that transcended architecture. It was about building a bridge between past and future. Before the official opening, we welcomed our first visitors, drawn by the stories surrounding the discovery of the artifacts and subsequent legal battle. Pueblo elders came to inspect that we were handling the sacred objects with the proper care, and they departed satisfied with our commitment to authentic preservation. Each visit strengthened my belief that I had made the right decisions, even when they cost me relationships I once believed were permanent. Rebecca made one last attempt to reach out through a lawyer, offering financial support for the cultural center in exchange for reconciliation. The proposal was insulting. She wanted to buy her way back into my life as if our emotional inheritance could be negotiated like a business deal. I instructed my lawyer to respond with a single sentence. Mr. Miller has no interest in any form of contact with his ex-wife. That was the last I ever heard from her. The final break with my past was completed the day I officially changed my address to the restored property. I sold our home in Santa Fe and moved permanently to the place where my great-grandfather had lived decades ago. It wasn't just a change of address. It was a declaration that I had chosen my side in the battle between profit and legacy, between personal revenge and cultural protection. Some nights when the desert silence surrounds me, I know that I am finally home. Life at the restored property brought a peace I hadn't felt in years. Every morning, I woke feeling the weight of responsibility. yet also the lightness of doing something truly meaningful. The house, once abandoned, now pulsed with stories and memories that transcended generations. It was a rebirth not only for me, but for the community around us. The cultural center became a gathering place for people of all ages, a space where the history of the Pueblo peoples was celebrated and respected. Children learned about their roots while elders shared stories that had once been confined to silent memories. I felt honored to serve as the guardian of this legacy, a role requiring more than architectural knowledge. It was a responsibility connecting me with past and future generations. Despite the scars left by the legal battle and the struggle, I found an inner strength I never knew I had. That journey taught me that true justice is not just a courtroom verdict, but the restoration of balance and dignity. Every step taken to rebuild the house and center was an act of triumph over silence and forgetting. Our story would not be erased, no matter what others tried. My routine changed completely. In addition to overseeing center activities, I dedicated time to learning the Pueblo language and traditions. I joined workshops, ceremonies, and community gatherings, feeling more deeply connected to my ancestral roots. This profound connection filled the voids left by my personal losses. I received letters and messages from people touched by the center's work. Stories of transformation, reconciliation with the past, and hope for the future arrived regularly. Their words reminded me daily of the impact an inheritance can have when honored with dedication and love. It was a living legacy that grew and renewed itself every day, touching lives in ways I could never have imagined. Sometimes, when the night silence enveloped the house, I reflected on everything that had happened, the pain of loss, the bitterness of conflict, and the victory that ultimately emerged through cultural preservation. These reflections strengthened me, reminding me that true triumph is building something greater than ourselves. Respect for oneself and others is the foundation of any genuine reconstruction. The cultural center wasn't just a physical space, it was a symbol of resilience and hope. The Pueblo community welcomed me as a brother, and together we built something that transcends time and generations. With every event and every visitor, I felt we were fulfilling a greater mission, a promise made by my ancestors. It was a cultural legacy that now had a life of its own and would continue to grow. Today, looking at the stars lighting up the New Mexico sky, I feel a deep peace. The journey was long and full of challenges, but I found my place in the world and my true purpose. The family I chose to protect goes far beyond blood. It's made of stories, memories, and a commitment to honor a legacy no one can take away. And that, I believe, is the true victory, the real fulfillment we all seek in our lives. Looking back, I realized the true inheritance was never about property or money. It was about discovering who I really was. Thomas's betrayal and Rebecca's abandonment forced me to find a strength I never knew I had. Sometimes, the greatest blessings come disguised as the worst injustices, and what seems like a loss might be exactly what we need. If you've made it this far, it's because you understand that stories like this aren't just entertainment. They're lessons about values and the importance of honoring our principles. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever gone through a situation where something that felt unfair turned out to be a hidden blessing? Share your own story of overcoming challenges. Each shared experience can inspire someone facing a difficult moment right now. If stories like this speak to your heart and make you reflect on legacy and the true values in life, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Every week I bring new narratives about people who found strength in adversity and discovered that true wealth lies in living with purpose. Together, let's keep exploring these powerful journeys of transformation that remind us what really matters in life.